Hi, and welcome to this lecture called Aleister Crowley, Rudolf Steiner, What Remains for the Future. Looking back at the 20th century, we can see that it was probably one of the most intense centuries ever. Regardless which kinds of glasses we put on to watch our own contemporary history closer, it's easy to see that the 20th century was phenomenal and revolutionary in many ways. Aleister Crowley claimed that 1904 was an especially pivotal year, as that was the year that when he had authored or received his key text, the Book of the Law. By declaring the law of Thelema and the Aeon of Horus, or the Child, Crowley positioned himself as a prophet and interpreter through devoting his life and efforts to informing and, hopefully, enlightening others. And he was pretty good at it, too. And his efforts have actually brought us together here today, which is indeed a magical thing. However, Crowley was far from alone in the participation of this aeonic shift. Several others presented similar ideas. Individualism, cosmic altruism, breaking away from too rigid cultural and religious structures, an integration of alternative spiritual methods that had, up until the shift, been looked upon as suspect and heretical, and so on. On the whole, the Zeitgeist included a holistic spirituality, integrating thoughts, ideas, and methods from other cultures, predominantly Asian ones. Theosophy was one main movement, and that stemming from Gurdjieff and his disciples another. Crowley's own Herculean labor of giving birth to this new eon has recently been well documented in several biographies, and I think most of us know his story fairly well. An initial curiosity about all things magical and esoteric, a first-hand experience of philosophical systems and religious approaches through all of his travels, and also a will to inform and enlighten through his Equinox magazine, in which he also divulged the secrets of the previous kings of the hill, mainly the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And then working with the Thelemic orders, the AA and the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, as well as writing ambitiously, to say the least. Although plagued by a great number of personal issues and problems, the impression we get of Crowley is still one of great devotion and self-discipline. And whether Thelema will become a major religion or philosophy in the future, we have yet to see. But if we stick with the human being Crowley for now, we can see that he is currently about as established as he can be. He is out there, present in contemporary consciousness, but perhaps more for his fascinating life story than for Thelema as a philosophy or religious system. Another important interpreter and innovator of this same New Age shift was the Austrian Rudolf Steiner. His creation of Anthroposophy has many similarities with Thelema, and I'm going to try and point out some similarities and also some differences in order to shine the light on how it is that these two movements have both been quite successful, but in very different ways and to varying degrees. Steiner for a long time contained his own individual enlightenment, which was a result of thinking, feeling, and willing, but also of contacts with a spiritual master, teacher early on. When the time came for him to eventually bloom during his successful career within Theosophy, he bloomed with a great appetite for sharing what he had experienced on the inner planes. And he too became good at that. Theosophy was soon no longer enough for him, and he created his own system and school, which, as we know, is called Anthroposophy. just as Crowley had done after the Golden Dawn experiences and the reception of the Book of the Law. Initially an academic specializing in Goethe studies, Rudolf Steiner gradually developed into a very creative polymath that also had the ability to enthuse people to help him out. Crowley published his 10 massive Equinox volumes between 1909 and 1913 under the banner of, quote, scientific illuminism, unquote, and the motto, the method of science, the aim of religion. Steiner called his method spiritual science and also wrote and lectured intensely to inform those who were interested. In this sense, both men were very much alike. Crowley was certainly more of a rebel, but they shared an ego-transcending will to improve mankind through the integration of non-rational phenomena within a contemporary and very rational mind frame, thereby bringing occult and spiritual ideas from both the outer and inner worlds into contact with modern society and its empirical standards and critical demands. Essentially, their wisdoms are one and the same. Namely, the human being can become enlightened and fully individual. One method of achieving this is to trust one's own intuition and be guided in inner spheres by strata of consciousness previously unacknowledged. Another similarity is by going through this process, one sets standards for others and inspires them to explore themselves. Altruism by proxy. Another similarity is a holistic integration of various human expressions, like science, art, culture, religion, into this overall philosophy that will benefit and further mankind, basically setting new stages and new standards. Another similarity is the holistic integration of teachings from different cultural spheres, the integration of yoga and meditation within a basically Western mind frame, Christianity in Steiner's case, Kabbalistic mysticism in Crowley's case, the idea of pragmatic synthesis. Basically, we're seeing a teaching that empowers the individual to see the bigger picture, something that will help others too, either by concrete measures or by inspiration. Trusting one's inner experiences and non-rational esoteric processes is of vital importance in both these cases. These must, however, be tested by empirical research and validated by usefulness in spheres larger than the merely individual. Phenomena that had previously been regarded as hocus pocus, or even superstitiously as the devil's work, were now becoming substantial parts of entire systems of philosophy for normal people from all walks of life. Communicating with angels, elemental entities, astral intelligences, etc., was suddenly presented as not only matters of fact, but also as recommended practices for better self-knowledge and development for modern people. Crowley used the Book of the Law and Thelema as springboards for applications and implementations on different fields of human behavior and existence, but seldom got further than theoretical blueprints. Steiner, on the other hand, networked intensely with people who had both assets and ideas of their own. For instance, the collaboration with the altruistic cigarette manufacturer Emil Molt initiated the first Waldorf school at Molt's factory Waldorf Astoria in Stuttgart in 1919. Today there are over 1,000 Waldorf schools worldwide. The construction of the first Goetheanum building in Dornach, Switzerland, this is Steiner's spiritual teaching center, was begun in 1913, but the building unfortunately burnt down in 1922. But the building of the new Goetheanum, this time constructed in fireproof concrete, was finished in 1928. Work on biodynamic farming and gardening was also initiated early on, as were clinical empirical experiments in anthroposophic medicine. Crowley's legacy is basically owed to a handful of individuals close to him at some point, quite late in his life. I'm thinking specifically of people like Carl Germer, Grady McMurtry, Gerald York, John Simmons, and Kenneth Grant. And if it weren't for the diligent archival obsession of Gerald York, for instance, and his donation to the Warburg Institute at the University of London, invaluable Crowley source material would be lost forever or scattered into the digital abyss of eBay. And if it weren't for these other men's exploitation of their own Crowley association, there would be no substantial Crowley presence today. The value of these few contacts, which were essentially uncontrollable for Crowley himself, has of course been enormous. And the value of Crowley's own publishing efforts, ditto. Gerald York not only donated his vast collection of information and Crowleyana to the Warburg, but also earlier on sent duplicates to Carl Germer in the US and Norman Robb in Australia. And despite this enormous foresight and benevolence, things and papers disappeared along the way, as they tend to do. It seems that the most important thing to leave behind are actually good old-fashioned books. Incidentally, the first book ever that stirred York's interest in things esoteric was one of Rudolf Steiner's. Steiner's legacy, on the other hand, was carefully strategized by himself while still alive. The massive amount of lectures, 4,941 lectures, are documented, but I don't know if that's even possible. I mean, he started out fairly late, around the turn of the century, within the theosophical environment, and then had approximately 25 very active years, which would mean some 200 lectures per year. Anyway, this opened doors to new environments and a constant flow of new people in different countries. And if even a fraction of these turned out to be benevolent, supportive, it was indeed a successful endeavor. And the publishing of his ideas was more or less immediate through printing houses, publishing companies that were anthroposophically supportive. The integration into society in the Germanic sphere was of course important and a very logical extension of several decades of German open-mindedness in various forms of Lebensreform movements. The Third Reich temporarily put everything in hiatus, of course, but not so much in neutral Switzerland, where the Goetheanum maintained its status as the international center of anthroposophy, and which it still is. Steiner integrated a kind of middle path that could but didn't necessarily involve a passionate union of opposites, quoting Crowley in his description of the magic of Horus. However, Steiner was indeed aware of the transformative magic of diametrics. His own schematic symbol for the ideal human being was a statue that he himself carved out of wood and which today is displayed at the Goetheanum. It's called the representative of man, Christ between Lucifer and Ahriman. This agnostic Christ principle balances the ungrounded spiritual loftiness of Lucifer with its ensuing pride and the gross Malkuthian materialism of Ahriman. An enlightened being who can balance these very human energies or temptations will have gained insight by the mere effort. And if we allow ourselves some philosophically speculative slack within the Thelemic pantheon, the statue could perhaps equally well be called Rahur Kuit between Nuit and Hadit. Steiner's progressive attitude to Christianity is without a doubt another reason why anthroposophy has been able to grow and mature without head-on collisions with established powerful and intolerant dogmas. Crowley early on took on a persona projected on him by his Christian fundamentalist mother, the Great Beast. That became an image that he himself nurtured throughout his life, and his antipathy towards all things Christian became one of many controversial trademarks. However, from the perspective of religious or philosophical studies, Thelema is decidedly neo-Gnostic. It's a neo-Gnostic system. The incentive for and manifestation of enlightenment is individual. Steiner intuited and put forth exactly the same idea, but Steiner's specific psychological fundament had no need of distancing itself from the religion that had prevailed up until the 20th century, not seldom through violence and oppression. Steiner analyzed the Christian mysteries and myths thoroughly and regarded in particular the human being Jesus' Golgothan experience when he was acting as an enlightened Christ, agnostic master, as the single most influential happening of this past eon. This should be regarded solely from a magical, transformative perspective, though not a dogmatic Christian one. Steiner and Anthroposophy are more in debt to Neoplatonism, pantheism, the Renaissance thinkers, and to Goethe than to any kind of dogmatic Christian church. Interesting to note in regard to Thelema as a cosmology with a strong solar presence through Rahur Kuit is that the Christ principle in Steiner's mythology is imbued with distinctly solar force filtered through the archangel Michael. The Golgotha experience is, in Steiner's eyes, not so much an individual self-sacrifice to redeem other people's sins, as it is a conduction of solar energy into the earth. So, what remains if we look at their main ways of expressing themselves? Both these men were voluminous writers, and basically everything there is has been made available for a very hungry market. In Crowley's case, recently, but very ambitiously. In Steiner's case, all along the decades. The availability these days not only has to do with spreading the words per se, but also with income for the respective organizations. There is a substantial value in both men's writings, and especially now that copyright issues are more complex and floating than ever. The copyright holders are eager to maintain a presence on the market, and that the books are published in high quality editions and translations secures both revenue and interest. And let's not forget that both men were also visual artists. Steiner was inspired by Goethe in more ways than one, and ambitiously tried to convey his own inner visions in visual form. Steiner's paintings and sculptures certainly display his will to communicate a higher system of aesthetics according to Goethe's guidelines, to be used for instructional purposes. The main auditorium of the Goetheanum building is an impressive, almost incredible display of this kind of Gesamt vision, in which architecture, stained glass images, mural paintings, light and acoustics work together to tell a story, to teach and to inspire. And there are several books focusing on Steiner's visual art available today. For Steiner, the use of art was ultimately pedagogic and magically strategic. Quote, "Beauty is not the divine in a cloak of physical reality. No, it is physical reality in a cloak that is divine. The artist does not bring the divine on to the earth by letting it flow into the world. He raises the world into the sphere of the divine. Beauty is semblance because it conjures before our senses a reality which, as such, appears as an ideal world." End quote. Crowley's paintings, drawings, and the Abbey of Thelema murals at Cefalù in Sicily were also creative externalizations, although considerably rougher in execution, and there seems to have been no other plan in painting them than simply to paint. Crowley's visual works exist today in private collections, and once in a while these are exhibited, like in London 1998, Paris 2008, and Australia in 2012. A substantial monograph of Crowley as an artist has yet to be published. Both Steiner and Crowley were extroverts, but for different reasons. Steiner was a distinct Apollonian character by Nietzsche's definition, and Crowley very much a Dionysian one. Crowley wrote well, but was inept at handling people not immediately of use to him. Steiner was not the best writer, but could deliver inspiring lectures en masse. Crowley was lucky to have a few intelligent people around when he was about to die. And, not forgetting, Crowley's publishing efforts have indeed been talismanically successful. Steiner was more of a structured Germanic mind and basically worked himself to death to secure the immortality of Anthroposophy. His bouquet is considerably larger than Crowley's, and we are all more or less exposed to it when we eat organically produced foods, for instance, or send our kids to Waldorf schools or use Veleda products. The pioneering research in Steiner's spiritual science has definitely made an impact on contemporary culture far more than Crowley's scientific illuminism, at least so far. If one wanted to be a little bit mean-spirited, one could present two parallel images under the umbrella of spiritual centers of the 1920s. One being a rundown farmhouse in a Sicilian fishing village, its walls painted with obscene poetry and impressionistic demons. The other one being an architecturally advanced and radical building in the Swiss countryside, designed to transmit the spirit of Goethe into the cosmos. However, it is totally unfair to measure these concepts or systems in terms of quantity and visibility. Crowley's system, after all, is either highly personal and secretive, as in the AA, or intra-fraternal, as in the OTO. The Thelemic environment is more of a private sphere in which spiritual, magical attainment is encouraged. And whether that is of any use or interest to anyone else is not relevant unless stated so by the adept in question. While on the subject of the OTO, I think I should mention too that Steiner met the head of the order at the time, Theodor Reuss, in 1906 in Switzerland, a meeting arranged by leading theosophist Annie Besant. This was pre-Thelema, of course. Pre-Thelema OTO, of course. And these gentlemen found enough common ground to stand on that Steiner actually became head of an OTO lodge called Mysteria Mystica. Steiner was curious as he had been about theosophy and also sought new environments in which to develop himself as a spiritual teacher. His engagement with OTO phased out quite quickly though. Reuss, Hartmann and the other early OTO protagonists had a somewhat strange reputation because it was more or less known, even back then, that OTO worked with esoteric, tantric sexual rituals in the higher degrees, and perhaps this became too much for Steiner, who was more or less celibate. Anyway, 6 years later, Reuss knocked on Crowley's door, and the rest, as they say, is history. At Christmas in 1923, Steiner announced to his followers that a new and more ambitious organization, the General Anthroposophical Society, had been set up, and that from now on the publishing of all his lectures was officially sanctioned. Both of these developments allowed for a much smoother and much more public life for the philosophy itself and its many creative offshoots. Steiner also announced a college for spiritual science that would teach advanced anthroposophy at the Goetheanum in Dornach and other places. The name alone makes me think of AA as a college of scientific illuminism, and there was apparently something in the air that allowed for these teaching structures to manifest on similar lines, regardless of whether they were public or highly secretive. As the old anthroposophical society gave way for this new and better organized one, Steiner personally issued and signed membership cards for all the old members, 12,000 of them. And the first big thing to deal with was the rebuilding of the Goetheanum, a large-scale process that actually continued in terms of final decorations well up until the 1990s. And the word general is perhaps a magical clue to the success of anthroposophy after Steiner's death, and of course, especially after the Second World War. Steiner's almost Taoist approach to merge with and augment, improve, develop, and never clash with or use force allowed for an easy integration into a general mind frame of general society. Sure, some of the ideas of Atlantean civilizations, reincarnation, cosmic farming, eurythmic healing, and so on may still be hard to grasp for most people, but no one can deny the common sense of eating biodynamically or at least organically grown food, or the well-documented success of the Waldorf education system, or the Camp Hill environments for individuals with learning disorders, etc. Crowley's attitude was almost diametrical to this, claiming the key to joy is disobedience. We can never find out if this was willed or if he was making a virtue out of necessity, but I suspect that his drug addiction was the biggest real demon in his life, not only because of the related financial and physical strains, but because of the will aspect. Although I'm sure he did want to get rid of the addiction, he simply couldn't. And we can rationalize and say that just makes him all the more human, etc. But for the great beast himself, I believe the persona as the agent provocateur of a new era defined by will was rather unwillingly upheld, and that he would much rather have been someone considerably more welcome in the upper echelons of British society. Crowley's hedonism facilitated a media image that in many ways still lingers on, and it is far from useful to Thelema as a general philosophy that has the potential to transform individual lives with or without the technology of magic. It is also highly interesting to compare these systems that are so alike in many ways, but also so very marked by their creators and their specific psychological traits. They were both aware of it, for good and bad, and of what lay behind. In both systems, the concepts of karma and reincarnation are present, and both men encouraged their adepts to research previous lives on the inner planes, as they had done themselves. If this wasn't done properly, one would perhaps have to make similar mistakes over and over again. Steiner was unusually clear when he wrote of these principles. Quote, "Through memory, the soul preserves yesterday. Through action, it prepares tomorrow." End quote. And, quote, "As a spiritual being, I must be the repetition of one whose biography can explain mine." Quote. And, quote, "I must connect to what I did yesterday if my life is to have order and continuity. Yesterday's actions have become the conditions that regulate what I do today. Through my actions yesterday, I created my destiny for today." End quote. There is in this integration of karma also an accentuation of the holistic. Despite the fact that we are individuals and we can only really develop on the individual level by gradual refinement, what we do also affects others and vice versa. These were thoughts that had been around for a long time, even in Europe. John Donne, the 17th century British poet, described it well several hundred years before Theosophy. quote, "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never sent to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." End quote. And perhaps Don is a good example in this case, as he too was in between faiths, so to speak. Having been born a Catholic in England, Don and his family had been exposed to intolerant, harassment, and even religious murder. And when he eventually became a Protestant within the Church of England, he was suddenly lauded and could speak and write freely about almost anything he wished, including the need for tolerance and open-mindedness. It is, in a way, as if restraint brings an inherent desire for freedom, and how this expresses itself has to do mainly with the ego of the person expressing it. Don was an intelligent opportunist who worked the system to his own benefit, and that has benefited us too, as his works and ideas were allowed to remain and survive. Crowley formulated instructions for the AA concerning knowledge of previous incarnations, as that was thought to be essential for magical development. In Liber 913, Fischarb, he constructed a method for the mind to work backwards in order to strengthen the individual memory to the level of transcending the present incarnation. Quote, "Memory is essential to the individual consciousness. Otherwise, the mind were but a blank sheet on which shadows are cast. But we see that not only does the mind retain impressions, but that it is so constituted that its tendency is to retain some more excellently than others." End quote. What remains if we look at other people's memories of these gentlemen? In Crowley's case, it depends exclusively on the vantage point of the first-hand writer in question. If Crowley was good to the writer, then the recollection is good. If Crowley was bad or perceived as bad to the writer, then the recollection is bad. A prime example of subjective history writing, and something which was amplified by the fact that he was so infamous as a public figure in the United Kingdom and beyond. It is as if the impressions of the man Crowley are so predominant that more or less objective analysis of his work from his own time are non-existent. His own descriptions are literally hagiographic, as in his own Confessions, for instance, and those of, say, Fuller or Frater Achad could easily be seen as hagiographic by proxy. It is mainly during the most recent decades that real Crowley biographies have been written. And these have indeed been very ambitious and well-researched projects. In Steiner's case, it is almost as if the person Rudolf Steiner doesn't exist. There is, of course, a great deal of hagiographic subjectivity in his case too, but that certainly doesn't stem from himself. He did write an autobiography at the request of his followers, but it is very low-key and basically a chronological recounting of meetings and projects. And, lest we forget, he didn't have the time to finish his own proper biography. It only goes as far as 1907, and that was in many ways when things started to become really interesting in his life. So we are left with other people's accounts of his life, and mostly of the yay-saying variety. As we can see, there are many similarities between the teachings. Crowley was predominantly interested in the technology of magic and of refining and handling the philosophy of the Book of the Law. Steiner was a magnificent visionary who also worked hard at trying the results and ideas out and making them useful for others. These gentlemen had similar goals, but were very different in individual behavior and attitudes. And perhaps we can allow ourselves to regard them as two aspects of the very same phenomenon or entity, like a Horus and Set, a Lucifer and Ahriman, a Christ and a great beast, where each facilitates a united dynamic energy in which a human individual can have an uncensored look at him or herself. And this is undoubtedly a fascinating area of study and speculation that requires a lot more research, and one that will be, I suspect, revealing and rewarding for both these cosmic philosophies of life. Thank you for listening to and watching this lecture. If you found it interesting, which I hope, please take a look at my other lectures and films at Vimeo. See you there. Thank you. Bye.